President Biden approves an $8 billion drilling project in Alaska, reversing his promises to stop drilling, period. Uganda proposes an anti-gay law with a prison sentence of up to 10 years, while President Biden calls states' proposal of banning transgender surgeries for minors, quote unquote, close to sinful. And for the second half of the show, I interview Carl Truman, the author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, a book that Ben Shapiro calls one of the most important books of the 21st century. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Shalom, my dears. That's what I say whenever I end the Dennis and Julie podcast, but I'm saying it here. It is Thursday, March 16th, 2023. You know the drill. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. You can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman. Big news story today, and certainly this week. Biden has greenlit an $8 billion oil drilling project in Alaska. Oh, how the turntables, as I used to say. The real expression is how the tables turn, but I just decided to switch that around to be fun. Biden has agreed to allow a Houston-based company, this is ConocoPhillips, to engage in the Willow Project, which again is an $8 billion oil drilling project in the North Slope of Alaska. I'm going to play some clips for you in just a few moments of President Biden affirming to the American people that drilling will be done with because, you know, drilling isn't so great for the environment. But it seems like he's changed his mind. Or maybe he knows that 2024 is just around the corner and he wants to be reelected. This is one of the biggest drilling projects in the United States. It is expected to pump out about 600 million barrels of crude oil over 30 years. That's 180,000 barrels a day. You can see I stumbled on my math there, but hey, I was a history major, forgive me. That's equivalent to about 40% of Alaska's crude oil production today. So this is a big project that is hugely going to increase oil production for the United States. The Biden administration has said that it will allow drilling on 3 out of the 5 proposed sites that ConocoPhillips wanted to drill on. I guess that's sort of President Biden's way of making a concession to the environmentalists by saying, hey, they wanted 5 sites, but I'm only allowing 3. But still, that's a lot that he's allowing. He's allowing them to build a 430-mile airstrip and 270 miles of pipelines. This will create 2,500 new jobs and generate $17 billion in revenue for the federal government. Now, although I was shading Biden for turning around on his promises to not drill and approve this project, this is a really good thing for the United States, not only because it will create jobs and revenue, as I just said, but crucially because it will take us on a path towards being oil independent. If you look back at our history, actually for many decades in the 20th century, and it reached a height in the 1950s, we, the United States, were not only oil independent, we were an oil exporter. We actually, our land, we think of the Middle East as being sort of the hub of oil, but our land has very rich oil reserves, especially in California with offshore drilling, also in New Mexico, Texas, and of course, Alaska. The Bureau of Land Management, though, has estimated that this will have an impact on climate change. The oil and gas extracted from this agreement will produce 280 million metric tons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. That is 9.2 million metric tons of carbon pollution, which is equal to adding nearly 2 million cars on the road each year. Now, the New York Times has reported that Alaska, over the past 60 years, has warmed twice as fast as the rest of the United States, and temperatures are expected projected to increase by 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the 30 years of this Willow project that President Biden has just approved. It really is important to note, though, the way that Biden has turned around and done something that he promised not to do. People will dismiss that as, oh, you know, people are hypocritical, politicians and presidents are hypocritical all of the time. But President Biden has really reached new heights as far as hypocrisy. I am not trying to suggest here that all people on the left or all progressives are hypocrites. But what I would like to point out for you is that baked into progressivism is sort of leeway for hypocrisy. Because if you think about it, what animates conservatives is conserving the principles of the American founding. One of the things that I love about conservatism is that when you're a conservative, you need to identify what it is that you want to conserve, what values and principles you wish to maintain, but incrementally improve. Progressives seek to progress away from certain values and principles. They see our country, our Constitution, our founding documents, our laws and statutes as needing to be living, breathing things that can evolve. And in some ways, that's good. But in other ways, again, it allows for this kind of hypocrisy because you can justify any change in your policy positions as, oh, I'm just progressing. If you look at Democrat politicians over the past few decades, it is really astounding to see how much they have turned around on key issues. There's a famous speech back in 2008 where the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is addressing Georgetown Law School, and he is saying that we need to control our southern border. He is referring to migrants as illegal aliens, which is a total no-no right now. And now Senator Schumer, along with other Democrat politicians, call those terms bigoted. They say that we don't need as much immigration control at our border and we should be a safe haven for migrants. That's one big way they've turned around. Another big way is, oh, I don't know, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and nearly every other Democrat politician being against gay marriage and then turning around when it was politically expedient and being for it. Again, this isn't changing your mind on things. Everyone is allowed to change their minds. And by the way, everyone should be open to changing their minds if there is new evidence or new circumstances that make you reconsider your beliefs. But the problem with Democrats and liberals today, not all but many, is that they do things that are politically expedient. They change their position based on what's in vogue during the day in order to curry favor with their constituents. And that is what President Biden is doing now. He knows that he is up for re-election. He knows that we have a huge oil problem. I mentioned on yesterday's show, I did a whole analysis on it, that the Saudis and Iranians just signed a deal to become closer to one another. At the end of last year in 2022, President Biden met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and begged the Saudi Crown Prince to give the United States oil because he has shut down so much of the drilling in the United States and our oil reserves. So he has gone and made entreaties to dictatorial regimes, whether it's Saudi Arabia or also in Venezuela. And the Saudi Crown Prince actually said no to President Biden. He said, sorry, dude, I don't like you. I don't like you Americans. I'm not going to give you oil. So President Biden knows that we really need to step up our oil independence. President Trump made us incredibly oil independent. He reopened those drilling facilities in New Mexico, Texas, Alaska, and California. But then President Biden, once he got into office, reversed those. I'd like to play for you 2 clips that show that President Biden once promised to not drill, and now he is going back. Let's listen to clip number 1.
No more drilling. There is no more drilling. I haven't formed any new drilling.
I haven't formed any new drilling. Okay, well, that was in November of 2022. Let's hear another clip where he says no drilling.
Number 1, no more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. End.
And here's a clip of him once saying that he opposed gay marriage.
The world's going to Hades in a handbasket, We are desperately concerned about the circumstance relating to avian flu. We don't have enough vaccines. We don't have enough police officers. And we're going to debate the next 3 weeks, I'm told, gay marriage, a flag amendment, and God only knows what else. I can't believe the American people can't see through this. We already have a law, the Defense of Marriage Act, where we've all voted, not where I voted and others said, look, marriage is between a man and a woman, and states must respect that. Nobody's violated that law. There's been no challenge to that law. Why do we need a constitutional amendment? Marriage is between a man and a woman. What's the game going on?
I mean, again, people are allowed to change, but once you get to that age and you are in politics, your views should be pretty cemented. And it's about principle. It's about your values and principles that you abide by. And if he's going on and vociferously condemning those who are trying to even bring up proposing a constitutional amendment, and then just a few years later he comes out and goes, I've always wanted gay marriage. Gay marriage should be legal. It's a human right. I mean, come on. It is absolutely absurd. He's a liar. That's what he is. Let's play another clip when he's lying about not knowing about his son's business dealings.
Joe Biden, he denied any knowledge of his son's business deals or ever even talking to his son about his foreign business dealings. Take a look.
Mr. Vice President, how many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings. I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses, period. And what I will do is the same thing we did in our administration. There will be an absolute wall between personal and private and the government.
Do you stand by your statement that you did not discuss any of your son's overseas business dealings?
Yes, I stand by that statement.
All right, Joe Biden lied to the entire country in photograph after photograph.
Meanwhile, as Sean Hannity is showing here, there are photographs that were exposed because of what was revealed in the Hunter Biden laptop of President, or then Vice President Biden, meeting with these Ukrainian and Kazakh and Chinese tycoons who his son was dealing with. And there are email exchanges between Hunter Biden and Hunter Biden's associate Yi Jianming, who is a Chinese energy tycoon, where they're negotiating a deal where Hunter Biden is asking for $10 million in introductions alone that the Chinese energy tycoon will pay to him. And Hunter Biden's business partner says, quote, "We want 10% to go to the big guy," which is our president, Joe Biden. So when you see something like this, you need to remember that this is someone who is lying and is just doing it for political gain. And we should not have someone like that in our highest office of the land. Moving on to other news, Uganda has proposed an anti-gay law with a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Uganda is a Central Eastern African country. It's to the right of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It gets $2 billion annually in funding from the United States. It's a part of our humanitarian funding that we give to various African countries. Uganda in 2014 passed an anti-homosexuality act, which prohibited sexual relations of the same sex. The bill actually originally wanted to make it punishable by a death penalty, but then it was generously reduced to just life in prison, which, please note my sarcasm, is obviously horrible. It also provided that those who left Uganda to pursue same-sex sexual relations must be extradited back to Uganda to be appropriately punished according to the law. Now, later that year, in August of 2014, the law was annulled by Uganda's highest court. But this week, the Ugandan parliament is proposing a new bill which proposes prison terms of up to 10 years for anyone who, quote, holds out, which is, I guess, their way of saying identifying, as, quote, lesbian, gay, transgender, a queer, or any other sexual or gender identity that is contrary to the binary categories of male and female. It also includes jail terms of between 2 and 5 years in prison for those who fund or support LGBTQ activities. According to the Wall Street Journal, the bill was introduced by opposition lawmaker Asuman Basalirwa. It also has the support of Uganda's ruling National Resistance Movement, which gives it a near certain majority in parliament. The man who proposed it, Mr. Basalira, said, quote, "We need to protect our society from the cancer posed by homosexuality. We cannot sit and watch as our values are eroded by Western groups who are actively recruiting our children into homosexuality." The Speaker of Uganda's parliament has said that she wants every lawmaker to vote for this bill, and she actually said, quote, "This is the time you are going to show us if you are a homosexual or not." Last month, the Church of Uganda actually severed ties with the Church of England over the Church of England's blessing of same-sex relationships. And if this bill is passed, Uganda will join many other African countries in criminalizing homosexuality. Homosexuality is illegal in around half of the 57 countries in the continent. And actually, in Mauritania, Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia, gay sex is punishable by death. There's a really important thing to note here in this story. Well, I suppose there are two things. First is the obvious that, the West gets so upset if someone makes a microaggression that they perceive as being unkind to gay people or trans people, not abiding by pronouns. They think that is the worst grievance in the world. The amount of ignorance that those on the left have about the world is just unbelievable. I bet if you walked up to the average leftist and said, "Do you know that gay sexual relations are punishable by death in several African countries?" They would have no idea. They have absolutely no idea about the way the world works. They think that women are so persecuted in the United States, that patriarchy runs rampant. How would you like to live in Iran, where if a woman is raped in Iran, she has to have a minimum number of male witnesses in order for her rapist to be in prison? How would you like to be a woman in Iran where you have to seek permission from your husband or father to gain an education, where you have to wear a hijab? I mean, the list goes on and on. How would you like to be in India, where there are anti-religious conversion laws? You can't convert. I mean, I could name continent after continent, country after country, where there are savage, evil policies that go against our basic foundations of human rights that people in the United States couldn't even dream of existing. It is just, again, I think sometimes we give these lefties, these crazy woke people, too much of a pass. We go, "Oh, well, they just see the world differently and we have to be nice to them." No, we need to tell them how ignorant they are, and they are undermining the country. They are about to ruin the best system that has ever been created, that has afforded the most civil and human rights to any group on history, because they are so offended if you don't abide by someone's pronouns. It is ridiculous. And that's why I am bringing stuff like this to your attention. I'm trying to arm you with these facts so you can put them in your arsenal to go fight this leftist sludge that is being hurled at us every single day. We have absolutely no idea the way the world works. That's number one. Number two, relatedly, leftists tend to see the world quite literally as black and white. As white people are just the oppressors of black people or non-white people, and non-white people never oppress white people or never oppress one another. And this story here in Uganda shows how very untrue that is. Again, I could name so many examples. Do leftists know about the amount of sectarian conflict that infects the Muslim world between Sunnis and Shias, that was most famously on display during the last decade in Iraq, when Sunni militants from the Islamist terrorist organization Al-Qaeda came and started persecuting the Shias in Iraq? These are Muslims persecuting Muslims, or Hindus persecute Muslims in India, and vice versa. Muslims persecute Hindus. Here in Uganda, these are black people who are persecuting other black people for being gay. The world is not black and white. And again, the more that people know about these facts, which is so important. Again, I am doing all of this research so that you don't have to. The more that people know about these facts, hopefully the more that they will come to see what an extraordinary thing the United States really is. Now, meanwhile, just an example of another person who is ignorant, but shouldn't be ignorant because he has been in politics for 40 to 50 years and is the President of the United States. President Joe Biden was recently interviewed, and he was asked a question about certain states' policies of wanting to ban transgender surgeries for minors. This has happened in Mississippi, in Utah, and specifically this interviewer brought up Florida. Here is what President Biden said about banning transgender surgeries for minors.
What's going on in Florida is, as my mother would say, close to sinful. I mean, it's just terrible what they're doing. It's not like, a kid wakes up one morning and says, I decided I want to become a man, or I want to become a woman, or I want to change. I mean, what are they thinking about here? They're human beings. They love, they have feelings, they have inclinations that are, it just, to me, is, I don't know, it's cruel. And the way we do it is we make sure we pass legislation like we passed on same-sex marriage. You mess with that, you're breaking the law, and you're going to be held accountable.
So many things that are scary there. Of course, transgender individuals have feelings and deserve to be treated well. That's a completely different story than allowing the mutilation of children who may not be of age to make a decision about their sexual identity. To call it also close to sinful, again, really just shows his level of ignorance. But with him, it's willful ignorance. With him, he wants to perpetuate this narrative that the United States has this contingent of people who are close to sinful for wanting to, protect the innocence and the bodily autonomy of children. It's just sickening. And also, let us not just move on from what he said at the end there, that we should pass, what did he say, an amendment or a law that should codify that transgender surgeries for minors should be allowed? Again, my friends, please remember this when you are voting in 2024. On to our final discussion today. You know that I like to make the world understandable. I like to try to figure out how we Americans got to the place where we are today, how things changed so much in the past 60 years. Well, if you're wondering the same thing and want some answers, I have the book for you. I just finished reading it. It is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It is an amazing explanation of what has happened in the United States and in the Western world over the past 60 years, the intellectual trends, the seeds of the modern ideas that have taken hold today. And I am honored to welcome the author of the book, Dr. Carl Truman, to the show. Dr. Truman is a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He is the author of several other books, including The Creedal Imperative, Luther on the Christian Life. I will talk to him a little bit about Luther because, as you viewers know, I love Martin Luther, and or at least reading about him, and Eric Metaxas' book on Luther. Dr. Truman also wrote Histories and Fallacies, and of course, we're talking today again about his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which Ben Shapiro calls one of the most important books of the 21st century. Hello, Dr. Truman. Thank you for coming on today.
It's great to be here, Julie. Thanks for having me.
As I told you before the show, boy, to get that kind of praise from someone like Ben Shapiro, calling it one of the most important books of the 21st century, that must have been very exciting for you.
It certainly boosted my sales, I think. He was very, very kind and has been very generous in his promotion of the book as well. So I'm very grateful to Ben Shapiro for his work on my behalf.
Well, now that I've read the book, I understand why he called it that, and I would like to echo it, though Ben Shapiro is probably a bit more well-read than I am, so he knows the many other books out there that would compete with yours, but yours is just, a really amazing overview of how we got here. So before we dive into some of your arguments, what motivated you to write this book?
There are a number of things, but I think the primary reason was I was fascinated by the speed at which transgenderism had become mainstream in the United States of America. It struck me as very odd that a sentence as counterintuitive and I would say as self-evidently wrong as I am a woman trapped in a man's body had become so plausible so quickly, not simply to academics and attendees at gender theory seminars at Berkeley, but to the ordinary man and woman in the street. And I was really interested in trying to work out why. Why is it that ordinary people are coming to buy into this kind of ideology when it flies in the face of both of history and of our own senses.
Right. And Dr. Truman's book, as background, focuses primarily on the sexual revolution, which you define as the series of events in the 1960s that made some of the sexual pathologies or realities of the world that have existed for as long as man has been on Earth. It made those legitimate. It legitimized those and made them really part of the modern self. So you start off the book just in the first few sentences with that quote that you just mentioned to me, "I am a woman trapped in a man's body." I found your discussion of that to be very interesting, specifically about the connection between the mind and the body, which is increasingly sort of a debate that's at the center of this modern idea of the self. Can you talk a bit more about that quote and, again, this connection or divide between the mind and the body?
Yes, well, when you think about the statement, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," for that to be regarded as making any kind of sense at all, we have to have come to a position in our culture where we grant supreme authority to feelings and deny any ultimate authority to our bodily constitution. Take a simple example to show why that's the case. Had you gone to your doctor 150 years ago and said, "I'm a woman trapped in a man's body," your doctor would have responded by saying to you, "That's highly problematic. It's a problem of the mind. We need to work on your mind and bring it into line with your body." If you go to your doctor with the same issue today, your doctor's going to say, that's a problem. It's a problem of the body. We need to bring the body into line with your mind. When you compare those two scenarios, what becomes clear is over the last 150 years, we have, as a Western culture, decided to grant far more authority to those inner feelings than to the physical makeup of our bodies. And that really lies at the heart of the story of how transgenderism has become so plausible in modern society.
Yes, the other thing that's interesting, and you point this out in your book, is that on the one hand, sex today is seen as a recreational activity, something, just sort of a regular expression that you do with your body. But then sexuality is sort of seen as at the very heart of your authenticity. There are so many of these contradictions in the modern world today. If you even think about the idea of womanhood, on the one hand, being a woman is this cherished, unique thing. There have been, people talk about the patriarchy and the amount that women have had to fight for equal rights. But then on the other hand, being a woman is sort of this frivolous thing that anyone can be as long as they identify it. So that quote that you brought up to start your book, I think, is a very good illustration of sort of those contradictions and those dualities. Well, is yourself primarily your body, or is it your mind? And we're seeing that more so it has become the latter, which causes many of our problems. So let's talk a little bit about your definition of the self, which is, of course, the point of your whole book. How would you define the self?
Yeah, but I'm using the self not in the common sense way, where we typically refer to myself or yourself, and what we mean there is a sphere of consciousness. So I'm aware I'm not Julie Hartman, you're aware you're not me, because we are separate consciences. What I'm talking about in the book is how we imagine ourselves as individuals to fit into this world. What is it that makes us us? What is it that gives us our most foundational identity? If you were to go back to the Middle Ages and talk about the self in the Middle Ages, then the self there would have been defined really by external relations. You would have been born in a certain place. You'd have belonged to a certain place. You'd have been part of a certain family. You would have pursued a certain trade or calling. These would have been the things that defined who you are. when we move to the present day, really we tend not to define the self so much in terms of external factors and external callings. We increasingly define the self in terms of our inner feelings. I am what I feel. It's my emotions. It's my ability to feel happy. I have this inner sense of psychological contentment. These are the things that make me who I am. And sex is a good example of that, because typically sex has been regarded as an activity. If you go back to the Bible, for example, the Bible's discussion of sex, the Bible's restrictions on sex, all focus on sex as an activity. These days, when we use terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual, even straight, we're not talking about an activity there. We're talking about an inner desire. And that's an interesting move, when sex ceases to be something that you do and becomes something that you are. That again speaks to this psychologization of the self that has taken place, that really underlies a lot of the political conflicts we're witnessing in our current day.
Yes, you talk in your book about how the modern person is understood, as the psychological person, and you attribute that term, a psychological man, to Philip Rieff. Is that right, Philip Rieff?
Yes, it's a term he uses to refer to what he considers to be the normative kind of person we have in the West today.
Yes, and it's that the self is seen, or the way that you can bring about your flourishing is if you psychologically, in essence, please yourself. If you do in the moment what feels right. And you're saying that this idea of your psychological self, your psychological needs and desires taking you over, is what the modern self has become. And it's moved away from, as you were saying, these external things, for instance, your duty to others, the way that you ought to behave, that used to define the self. I'm fascinated by this idea that you were speaking of how your sexuality or your sexual identity has become so intrinsic to who you are in the eyes of the modern world. I talk a lot about, I just graduated from college, and one of the things that was so shocking to me when I went to school was seeing the way that people quite literally wore the uniform of their sexual identity or of their demographic group. People would walk around campus with these sweatshirts, or a big thing was computer stickers. They would have all these stickers on their laptop that would say, proud bisexual woman, she, hers, queer students organization. At the graduation, it was like a mock trial assembly of the United Nations. It was, everyone was wearing these sort of, I don't know what you would call them, not tassels, but these piece of cloth around themselves that would either say that they were part of the Black student organization, the queer, the lesbian student organization. And it shows just how much people think that who they are is their sexuality or those parts of their identity. I'd like to ask you, what about the 60s made it that moment where these things sort of burst to the surface, where this understanding of the self was revolutionized? It seems to be that there's sort of an obsession with sex that started in the 60s and has gained incredible momentum today.
Yes, I think the 60s are a watershed moment. Of course, it starts before the 60s.
Right.
The whole psychologization of what it means to be a human being goes back several centuries before the 1960s. I think what happens in the 60s, it's a confluence of a number of things. First of all, there are technological developments. We have the developments of antibiotics in the 1940s, and then of efficient forms of contraception, which get legalized and become very common in the 1960s. Well, antibiotics and contraceptives make it possible to dramatically detach sex from any consequences, either in terms of disease or in terms of pregnancy. So it becomes possible to imagine sex as a recreation at that point. Secondly, you have some powerful ideological impulses as well. Impulses really stemming from Germany in the 1930s, where Freud was picked up by a group of dissident Marxist thinkers. But you have this idea developing in the 60s that oppression is not something that is primarily economic, it's something that's primarily psychological. And therefore, such things as sexual codes come to be seen as oppressive of the person, precisely because they are delegitimizing certain ideas, certain psychologized views of the self, for example. And then thirdly, I think you have a major crisis in the external authority of institutions. The Vietnam War, for example, the rise of rock music, the alternative culture. These are things that shake and to a great degree shatter much of the traditional external authority in our country. It was funny, interesting that you referred to graduation and the sort of the rainbow colors at graduation. When I graduated in the 1980s from the University of Cambridge in the UK, even our socks were inspected before we graduated because everybody had to dress exactly the same. And that's because the institution had power, and graduation was not a question of performing as an individual. It was a rite of passage whereby you came to belong to this organization that was much bigger than you. What we've seen really unfolding since the 1960s has been a conception of institutions, not as places of formation, but as places of performance. And now the idiom of that performance is highly sexualized. So what you're describing there is a fascinating example of how the sexual revolution doesn't just draw on technology, doesn't just draw on ideology, but also capitalizes on the transformation of traditional institutions from places of formation to places of performance.
I envy your college graduation. I would have loved if Harvard higher-ups inspected us. You know, I was thinking on that day, and it sounds funny, but it is sadly true. If someone came dressed up as a dinosaur, they would have allowed it. And if that person said, I identify as a dinosaur, I want to be a dinosaur at my graduation, they would have completely allowed it. Seriously, they would have. It's a sign of the times. Your book, I need to tell the audience, it is so riveting because you pulled together, as you point out, you know, the 1960s was sort of this perfect storm of brewing political and cultural trends that actually started centuries back with people like Rousseau and Nietzsche. We're going to get to some of those figures later in the interview. And your discussion of technology was especially interesting. How fascinating it is to think that, you know, birth control, which can make sex not just about an act of procreation, but really a recreational act, and antibiotics, which can help mitigate the results of sexually transmitted diseases, how technology transforms our behavior. And we see those things as good things, and in many ways, of course, they are, but they have contributed to this culture of promiscuity. Before we move on, though, I want to go back to what I was asking before about this obsession of sex, because you see today, you know, even I don't know if it was the Golden Globes that I was watching. I don't watch those shows very much anymore, but the people are wearing such revealing dresses, and some of the speeches people reference sex, and certainly we see in schools with drag queen story hours, there's this robbing of children's innocence, and there seems to be this very odd, sick thing that's coming back to wanting to make everything sexual. Is that an innate thing in human beings that has been, you know, you say in your book, things like adultery, promiscuity, homosexuality have been around for millennia, but the sexual revolution legitimized it. Is this obsession with sex something that has been sort of intrinsic and the sexual revolution legitimized it, or has it been something that has been learned and developed and exacerbated with the momentum of the sexual revolution?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one would first of all have to say that clearly sexual desire and the erotic are very powerful and perennial elements of human culture. The reason why we can read the Iliad today is because we may not live in ancient Greece, but we can sympathize with the dynamics of the story. The dynamics of the Iliad story is essentially the dynamic of countless American soap operas and sitcoms every day. Some guy falls in love with another guy's wife, can't control himself, runs off with her. The husband gets angry, chases after them, etc., etc. We all understand that story because it speaks to something, I think, that is perennial in human existence. There is a powerful sexual aspect to what it means to be a human being. What's made it different, I think, is the natural social controls that have historically existed relative to sexual behavior. If you sleep with a girl, you get her pregnant, there are going to be consequences to that. If you sleep around, you're going to get a disease, there are going to be consequences to that. If you want to indulge in pornography, your neighbor might see you going into that seedy store and report you to your parents. These natural social consequences have pretty much disappeared today and have really allowed us to imagine that sexual indulgence can be a harmless recreation. And that's also combined with the way that certain Freudian ideas have come to grip the imagination, that the idea that human fulfillment and human happiness is found in sexual satisfaction. And that's a message. You don't have to have read Freud to have received that message. You merely have to have watched, as you pointed out, the Golden Globes, the Oscar red carpet, any soap opera, any movie that's produced today. That is the message that is being constantly pushed, that you are your sexuality and that sex is a cost-free recreation that you can and should indulge in if you're going to be a fulfilled human being.
And it has harmed women the most. I speak a lot about on my show with Dennis Prager, Dennis and Julie, the rampant hookup culture that exists in college and in high school. I didn't really know much about that. I went to an all-girls school, so I was shielded from that until I went to college, but I know it does exist in high school, where modern-day feminism teaches women that it is empowering. As you say, it is an intrinsic part of your identity to be promiscuous and sexually active, and they teach that you can go and have one-night stands with men, and you can get just as much fulfillment from that as a man does. But the harsh reality is that A, women can't afford to be as promiscuous as men with their sexual behavior, and B, women do not desire to be as promiscuous as men with their sexual behavior. We are much more inclined to pursue commitment with our partner rather than frivolous sexual activity. So there's been this very bizarre distortion that of values. And what's also interesting is that these ideas are so powerful that they've unraveled our nature. Our nature is to, again, not be promiscuous unless you have some kind of commitment. Our nature as women, I'm talking about. Even our nature as women is to protect the innocence of children. And these ideas from the sexual revolution are so powerful that they're unraveling that nature.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. And it's interesting reading some of the early feminist literature from the 1970s. There were feminists already worried in the 1970s that the sexual revolution was actually facilitating greater objectification and sexual use of women. And it was not the liberation that it promised to be. And of course, in more recent days, we're seeing the rise of feminists who are beginning to react against the sexual revolution now, seeing feminists starting to speak about the sexual revolution has not been good news for women. It's led to all kinds of problems. So you can run from nature for so long, but sooner or later nature bites back. And I think intelligent human beings across the political spectrum can see that, and I'm encouraged in some ways that there are feminists responding. I think of Mary Harrington in England, who's writing great stuff now on the sexual revolution. She was a feminist and is realizing that no, this is not delivering the liberation that it promised. And I think as you hinted at the start of your question then, Julie, one could say, the sexual revolution was just another male con trick. I mean, the pill does not liberate women. It actually liberates men from the consequences of sexual activity. It messes with the biology of women, and it allows men to get away with sleeping around.
Very true. The men must be rejoicing because of the sexual revolution, because it really has overwhelmingly benefited them. I would like to go on to some of these figures that you analyze, and God bless you, by the way, because I told you that my senior year of college, I challenged myself by taking a political philosophy course. And, you know, when one reads Nietzsche or Rousseau, especially Nietzsche, you need a drink or about 5 drinks after reading Nietzsche. He is one hard dude. If you could say something in a simple way, Nietzsche takes it and adds 50 more words, dashes, tries to make it difficult. So you synopsize them in a wonderful way. Again, bless you for doing that. So let's start with Freud, who is a bit easier. I know people, very, very smart people, who think Freud is a genius. And I also know very, very smart people who think Freud is a fraud. Where do you stand? You talked a bit about Freud sort of legitimizing these ideas that the sexual you is an intrinsic part of you. Do you think there's any parts of Freud that are legitimate?
I think Freud's an interesting figure. Much of his thinking has been debunked. As far as I understand it, his, the Oedipus complex idea is no longer taken particularly seriously by psychologists. I think where Freud is useful and where he has insights really is as a philosopher of culture. He understands that the sexual drive is very powerful in human beings. He understands that there's a dark and destructive dimension, foundation to what it means to be human. Now, as a Christian, I see that as a result of the fall. Freud simply sees it as a structural part of what it means to be a human being. But human beings as constituted now, both of us would agree that human beings have this dark and destructive and irrational drive. And I think that's important. The other thing that Freud, I think, is very good on is this, and the thing he points to is the fact that sexual codes are necessary for the maintenance of society and civilization. Now, he and I might disagree on which sexual code should be in place, but I think what Freud allows us to see is this, that when a society changes its sexual codes, it's not the equivalent of a society changing its basic rate of income tax. People can disagree on what the basic rate of income tax should be, but a society's fundamental constitution is not changed by whether the basic rate of income tax is 24 cents in the dollar or 25 cents in the dollar. When you start to tinker with sexual codes, something very profound is going on in society. Freud would really say, if you start to overturn sexual taboos, you are playing a very dangerous game with the stability of the society in which you find yourself. And that's where I think he has great insights for today, because what we're witnessing in the West in general, and places like the United States in particular, with a wholesale repudiation of traditional sexual codes, this is something that no society's ever done before. It's a question as to, big question in my mind, can we get away with this? We have no idea what we're unleashing at this point. And I think that's where Freud is very, very helpful, really as a philosopher of culture rather than as a psychologist or psychoanalyst.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of sexual codes, you write in your book about the 2015 Supreme Court decision Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage. Can you please speak more about what that decision did as far as the sexual revolution, again, that started in the 60s and is arguably sort of continuing and evolving? How did that Supreme Court decision change things?
Well, it's interesting. On one level, it didn't change very much because we already had no-fault divorce in the United States. And no-fault divorce really assumes a definition of marriage where it's a sentimental contract between two people. And as soon as the contract isn't working for one side or both sides, they can simply escape from it. So we already had a definition of marriage that basically took no account of children and didn't really see reproduction as lying at its heart. I think where it makes a big difference is it really has opened the floodgates for the wholesale sexual transformation of society. There were journalists like Andrew Sullivan arguing that gay marriage would simply incorporate gay couples into a conservative institution, that it wouldn't change very much. It basically brought into an established institution another kind of partnership. I think Andrew Sullivan's analysis has been proved to be wrong in that what we don't have is simply the incorporation of gay couples into a conservative institution. What we have now is a conservative institution that has been thrown into complete chaos. Why does it need? I teach Obergefell v. Hodges in class each semester to final year students, and one of the points I make is there's really an assertion in the Supreme Court judgment that marriage is to be between two people. But once you take sexual complementarity and reproduction out of the essence of marriage, there's no reason why it should be two people. It could be 3 guys and 4 girls, 10 guys and 6 girls. Any combination that makes the contractors happy can surely be legitimized. So what gay marriage really does in 2015, I think, is it doesn't simply redefine marriage. That had already been done. It effectively abolishes what marriage did for the sexual practices of society, which was provide some sort of paradigm, stable norm. That's gone. And what we've seen over the last 8 years really is the opening of the floodgates of every weird and wonderful sexual combination and practice that one could imagine.
What you just said about the way that you phrased it, when you take sexual, the ability to be sexually complementary and the reproductive aspect out of marriage, then it sort of opens the floodgates. Those were 2 very important things that you mentioned that again provided me with a lot of clarity, because people use the love argument and they go, well, why can't it be between 2 people of the same sex? Why does it just have to be between a man and a woman? But there are those 2 biological components that make that institution of marriage between a man and a woman that go beyond just their love and attraction for one another. That was very helpful.
And the law recognized that. The reason why we have definitions of marriage originally, of course, is to protect children.
Yes.
That's why we have these laws, to stabilize the relationship, to protect children. What we've done is taken children out of the equation.
Right.
And lo and behold, found ourselves with an institution that no longer has a rationale or a stability to it.
Mm-hmm. So now that we've discussed Freud, let's move on to Rousseau. I told you that as I was reading Rousseau in college, I was stunned to see that this 18th century Genevan philosopher was essentially spouting the same lines as we hear from many progressives today. That is, Rousseau's main thesis statement is that people are born perfect in the state of nature. Of course, how would Rousseau know that? How would any of us know that? And that it is society that corrupts us, not that we corrupt ourselves. What else about Rousseau and his ideas contributed to the modern conception of the self today?
I think Rousseau's important for a couple of reasons, in addition to the one you've cited. First of all, his theory of education. He's really the father or the grandfather of child-centered views of education. So that makes him very significant for us. But he's also one of the pioneers of thinking of human beings as being fundamentally autonomous. In his book, The Social Contract, he makes the famous statement that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. What he's really saying there is that human beings are autonomous, and every relationship in which they find themselves is fundamentally a contractual one. And everybody you meet is, I would say the natural reading of Rousseau is that everybody you meet is first and foremost potentially a problem who can get in the way of your personal happiness. And if they prove themselves not to be, then somebody that you can enter into a contractual relationship with. It's fundamentally wrong-headed, but appeals to us. I mean, who doesn't want to think of themselves as autonomous? Who doesn't want to think of themselves as the center of the universe? It's nonsense, of course, because human beings, of all creatures on the face of the earth, are born in rather remarkable states of dependency. My boys were dependent upon me really until they graduated from college in their early 20s. I use the example in class of hamsters. If you're a hamster, you're independent of your parents at 21 days. Human beings are dependent for a long, long time. And really what Rousseau does is he sets up a very plausible but fundamentally wrong-headed anthropology. And if you take his anthropology as basic, then you end up with all of the problems that we find ourselves with in modern society.
Before we talk about Nietzsche, and by the way, that was very helpful, thank you. I want to quickly ask you, how did these thinkers' ideas sort of seep into our modern world? Because I'm thinking of an audience member who's listening going, well, Rousseau wrote in the 1700s. How is he really important to 21st century Western civilization? The hippies in the 60s that were singing about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I doubt were reading the first and second discourses. So how did these thinkers become, their ideas become relevant and again seep into our culture?
It's a good question. It's a hard one to answer in a very simple or straightforward way, but I would say a number of ways. With Rousseau, of course, you have his philosophy of education, and his philosophy of education does grab the imagination of many educational institutions in the Western world. So child-centered education, this idea that education is not about forming the child, about molding the child to fit into society, not about making everybody wear the same clothes to graduate, but actually encouraging children, students, etc., to be who they really are, to be individuals. That's one way that Rousseau's thinking percolates into the modern world. It's also the message that's sent from a lot of, I would say, soap operas, sitcoms, movies. One of the things that Rousseau's thinking tilts towards, of course, is seeing younger children as wiser than older adults. The idea is that society screws you up. Well, think about Hollywood movies. When was the last time you saw a recent Hollywood movie where children apologize to parents? It doesn't happen very often in Hollywood movies these days. Quite often you'll get parents apologizing to children. That's sending a message about what it means to be wise and who are the wise among us. Think about Greta Thunberg, for example. Why is it that the world is taking so seriously a teenager now, setting aside where one stands on any of the environmental issues she's commenting on? It should be patently obvious that she's remarkably unqualified to comment on them as a teenager. Right. And yet we have world leaders lining up for photo opportunities with her. Well, that's sending a Rousseau message. People watching that, they're getting a Rousseau message. Young people are wise, old people are corrupt. So Rousseau's message, you have to read Rousseau to see his fingerprints all over the artifacts of pop culture that we now experience everywhere.
Yes, well said. And now on to, oh, and by the way, before I go to Nietzsche, I just want to say, when you were talking about the veneration of youth, if you look at Mussolini's Italy and the anthem, I believe perhaps it's well, no, it wouldn't still be the anthem of Italy, but there was an anthem during Mussolini's time that venerated the youth. Part of these authoritarian movements is that the youth, because most of them are so radical, are seen as wiser and better than the adults. So on to, as I like to say, the guy after you read, you need a whole bottle of wine, Nietzsche. Can you please explain to us in a way that we won't need a bottle of wine how Nietzsche contributed to this story?
Well, Nietzsche's a fascinating character for a number of ways, but I think his primary importance for the story I tell is that he blows the lid off the Enlightenment. His real targets, although he's typically regarded as an anti-Christian philosopher, and he certainly was an anti-religious, anti-Christian philosopher, but a lot of the time his targets are actually Enlightenment thinkers. he felt that the thinkers of the Enlightenment, the Immanuel Kants of this world, were playing a double-handed game. On the one hand, they wanted to get rid of God. They wanted to marginalize the sense of the sacred and sacred order. On the other hand, they wanted to retain the broad morality of Christianity. And what Nietzsche does is essentially say, you can't do that. You can't get rid of God. You can't kill God, as he would say, and then retain the moral structures that were built upon God. And he presses this in a very radical way, essentially to say, everything that you think of as stable, all the categories that you use that you think are given and solid, they're all actually grounded in a view of the universe that ultimately rests upon a belief in a divine being, in a belief in God. If you get rid of God, then everything is up for grabs. All categories get destabilized at that point. And so what's interesting about Nietzsche is his reputation in the 20th century was that he's a philosopher of the right. Everybody thinks, oh, Nietzsche was a guru for the Nazis. Well, no, not really. Nietzsche was not a guru for the Nazis. Nietzsche actually pops up quite remarkably, really on the left in the latter part of the 20th century, with various postmodern thinkers who start calling into question stable categories. Male and female, for example. Think of the gender theorist Judith Butler. She draws a lot from Nietzsche. And what she finds helpful in Nietzsche is his idea that, if you get rid of this stabilizing framework, which is rooted in God, everything is up for grabs. Everything can be questioned. Everything can be challenged, because really we're not engaged in a game of talking truth. We're engaged in a game of using ideas to manipulate other people. So Nietzsche really lies very much at the heart of a lot of the chaos we see in society around us at this point in time.
He certainly does. He writes at the beginning that if you subscribe to, at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, that if you subscribe to another religion or ideology, you're a slave to that ideology. Then you're not your own autonomous person. We could talk about Nietzsche, Rousseau, Freud, any of these for an entire episode. But for the sake of time, I have a final question for you, though I'd love to have you on again so that we can go more in depth about these individuals. I so appreciate your time today. It's been wonderful. But to close, I'd like to ask you, you do such a great job of analyzing the modern self today, which is really a modern self that all of us should not aspire to be, but that has sadly taken over. Can you give me an idea of the old Western or American modern self? How was the self defined in the good era, if you will? How should we see ourselves?
I think if you go back to the Middle Ages, I mentioned earlier on, the self is defined very much in terms of external obligations. And so I would say to listeners, to people watching today, if you want to think about how to think about yourself and how perhaps to make you and your little world a symbol of protest against what's going on in wider society, then start thinking of yourself as a dependent, rational creature. Start thinking of yourself not so much in terms of your autonomy and freedom, but start thinking of yourself in terms of, what are my obligations towards others? If I'm married and I have kids, my marriage is not about me and my wife, or not simply about me and my wife. My marriage exists in order for me to be able to provide a stable and safe environment for my children to grow up. When you start thinking of yourself in that way, I think you're capturing something of the traditional or the past notion of the self, where the self was tied to community, tied to obligations. Think of traditional ways of dancing. If you watch the old Jane Austen productions on the TV, when Mr. Darcy dances, he dances as part of a group, and he makes sense because he respects the dance moves of everybody else. Think about life in that way. Why do we make sense? Why do our lives make sense? Well, they make sense, I think. They truly make sense of what it means to be a human being when we take as basic the fact that we're not autonomous, but to stand in relations of dependency and obligation towards other people.
It's a paradoxical or seemingly paradoxical thought that you actually become more you when you're not thinking so much about you, when you're thinking about others. Thank you so much for being here. Again, Dr. Truman's book is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It is a fascinating read. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me on, Julie.
Thank you for joining us today, and remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Take care, everyone.